May 6, 2013, Ancaster, Ontario. "I'll be right back," says 32-year-old Tim Bosma, sliding out of his driveway to show two strangers a truck he was selling. He never comes home. A week later, police would find bone fragments inside an incinerator on a private farm. And what began as a routine test drive would become one of Canada's most chilling cases. Today, we're breaking down a true crime case that began with a routine test drive and ended in one of the most disturbing investigations in Canadian history. Quickly, before we dive any deeper, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. These documentaries take a lot of research, and subscribing is the best way to support the channel. On the night of May 6, 2013, Tim Bosma walked out of his house in Ancaster, Ontario, expecting to be gone for maybe half an hour. He told his wife he'd be right back. It was just a test drive. Inside the house, his wife Charlene was with their 2-year-old daughter, getting ready for the night. Everything about the evening felt normal, quiet, routine. The kind of night you don't remember the next day, unless something goes wrong. Tim was 32 years old. He worked in metal fabrication, long hours, steady work. Friends described him as reliable, the kind of guy who did what he said he'd do. He and Charlene were building a life together, and like a lot of families, they were making practical decisions where they could. One of those decisions was selling Tim's black 2012 Dodge Ram pickup truck. He'd listed it online a few days earlier. Most of the messages were ordinary, people asking questions, negotiating prices, but one inquiry stood out. 2 men said they were interested and wanted to see the truck that night. Tim mentioned it to Charlene, not in a worried way, just casually. It was late, sure, but not unheard of. Before leaving, he kissed his daughter goodnight. He told Charlene he'd be back soon. A short message followed. Nothing meaningful, nothing memorable. Just the kind of check-in couples send without thinking twice. Around 9:30 p.m., the 2 men arrived at the Bosma home. They talked briefly in the driveway. Then Tim got into the driver's seat of his own truck. One man sat beside him. The other climbed into the back. The engine started. The truck pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street. That was the last confirmed moment Tim Bosma was ever seen alive. At first, there was no panic. Test drives don't always run on schedule. Charlene waited. She checked her phone. She sent a message. Nothing. As the night went on, that uneasy feeling started, creeping in. She tried calling Tim. No answer. By about 10:30, his phone was going straight to voicemail. That wasn't like him. Tim always picked up, and if he couldn't, he'd call back. Midnight came and went. By then, something felt very wrong. Charlene kept calling. She kept checking the driveway. Every sound outside made her look up, but Tim didn't come home. And finally, in the early hours of May 7th, she contacted police and reported her husband missing. Officers from the Hamilton Police Service responded right away. From the start, the situation didn't sit right. An adult disappearing during a test drive with strangers wasn't typical. Investigators began piecing together Tim's final movements almost immediately. They spoke with neighbors. They reviewed surveillance footage from nearby homes. They went through the online messages connected to the truck listing. Everything they could find, they collected. By morning, police made the disappearance public. What followed was a massive response. Multiple police services got involved. Officers searched rural roads, wooded areas, and farmland around Hamilton. K-9 units were brought in. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers showed up to help, hoping against logic that Tim might still be found. Behind the scenes, investigators focused on the digital trail. The phone number used to contact Tim led them to a man named Dellen Millard. That name quickly became central to the case. When police followed that lead, it pointed them toward properties in the Waterloo region, including an aircraft hangar. Search warrants were executed. Officers moved into industrial buildings and rural land tied to Millard. At that point, the investigation changed. Publicly, police were cautious. Privately, the urgency was clear. Hamilton's police chief would later say the case was deeply concerning from the very beginning. Resources were mobilized quickly, not because they wanted attention, but because everything about Tim's disappearance suggested this was no ordinary missing person call. For Charlene Bosma, those days blurred together. She spoke to the media, asking anyone with information to come forward. Tim's photos spread across the country. Vigils were held. Strangers sent messages of support. But despite the searches, despite the attention, Tim didn't come home. What started as a routine test drive had now become one of the largest investigations Hamilton had ever seen. And as police continued following the evidence, it was becoming clear that Tim Bosma hadn't simply vanished. Something terrible had happened. And the truth was closing in. As police worked through the first critical hours of Tim Bosma's disappearance, one name kept surfacing in their files. It came from phone records, online messages, and the digital trail left behind by the truck listing. That name was Dellen Millard. Millard was not someone who blended into the background. In his late 20s at the time, he was the heir to a prominent aviation business based in Ontario. His family owned an aircraft manufacturing company, and Millard had grown up around private planes, hangars, and money. He had access to property most people never set foot on: industrial hangars, rural land, specialized equipment, the kind of places that don't attract attention unless police are already looking. To the outside world, Millard presented himself as ambitious and unconventional. He dressed sharply, posted frequently on social media, and spoke openly about wealth, innovation, and success. Friends described him as confident, sometimes to the point of arrogance. He enjoyed pushing boundaries and did not respond well to being challenged. His lifestyle allowed him to move through spaces most people never encountered, with resources that let him handle problems quietly and privately. When investigators followed the phone number used to contact Tim Bosma, it led them directly to Millard. Almost immediately, police began focusing on properties connected to him, including an aircraft hangar near Waterloo in the rural Ayr area. Within days of Tim's disappearance, officers were seen entering and searching the hangar. The shift was unmistakable. This was no longer a missing person investigation built on hope alone. Law enforcement was now working under the assumption that a serious crime had occurred. As Millard came into focus, another figure emerged alongside him, a man named Mark Smich. Smich was different in almost every visible way. He came from a far more ordinary background and didn't have Millard's money or status. He was younger, quieter, and far less polished. Where Millard projected control, Smich appeared uncertain, drifting between jobs and unstable living arrangements. The two men had met years earlier and maintained an on-and-off friendship that placed Smich squarely inside Millard's orbit. Court records would later show that Smich often relied on Millard financially. He borrowed money. He stayed at properties Millard controlled. He remained close to Millard's social circle, even if he never fully belonged to it. At the time of Tim's disappearance, that connection was enough to place him on investigators' radar. Early on, police were careful. They did not publicly accuse either man. Instead, they worked quietly, confirming timelines, reviewing surveillance footage, and gathering evidence piece by piece. On May 11, 2013, just 5 days after Tim Bosma vanished, police made their first major move. Dellen Millard was arrested. The arrest came as officers continued searching the hangar and other properties tied to him. Images of Millard being taken into custody spread quickly, marking a turning point in the case. For the first time, the public saw a face attached to the disappearance, and the investigation shifted from uncertainty to accusation. Even then, police were not finished. As Millard remained in custody, investigators continued building their case. Their focus widened to include anyone who may have helped, either before or after the crime. That brought attention back to Mark Smich. On May 22, 2013, more than 2 weeks after Tim disappeared, Smich was arrested. Police confirmed he had been charged in connection with the case. With 2 arrests now made, investigators had effectively confirmed what many had feared. Tim Bosma had not simply gone missing. He had been targeted. But the story did not end there. In the months that followed, police identified a third individual connected to the aftermath of the crime. Her name was Christina Naudga. She had been romantically involved with Dellen Millard around the time of Tim's disappearance. Investigators alleged that after the crime occurred, she assisted in covering up what had happened. On April 10, 2014, nearly a year after Tim was last seen, Nodga was arrested and charged with being an accessory after the fact and obstructing justice. Prosecutors would later argue that she helped move evidence and mislead investigators. Her role, while secondary, added another layer to the picture police were assembling, a small circle, bound by loyalty, secrecy, and decisions that spiraled quickly out of control. Throughout this period, police held carefully worded press conferences. Arrests were confirmed. Searches were acknowledged. Details were limited. Every statement was deliberate. Every release grounded in evidence that had already been tested. Behind closed doors, investigators were piecing together how these individuals connected, where they went, and what each of them did in the hours and days after Tim Bosma disappeared. Phone records, witness statements, surveillance footage, and forensic findings were slowly forming a single, cohesive narrative. For the Bosma family, the arrests brought no relief, only confirmation that their worst fears were real. The case had moved from uncertainty into something far more concrete and far more devastating. The suspects now had names, faces, histories, and as the investigation continued, police were preparing to reveal evidence that would show just how deliberate this crime had been, and how far some people were willing to go to erase what they had done. The investigation into Tim Bosma's disappearance changed permanently when police began uncovering physical evidence that did not rely on witness memory or speculation, but on what was left behind. One of the first major breakthroughs came from a piece of equipment most people had never heard of. On property connected to Dellen Millard, investigators discovered an industrial animal incinerator. During the trial, it would be referred to repeatedly by a nickname that sounded almost unreal: the Eliminator. It was designed to burn animal remains at extremely high temperatures, reducing almost everything to ash. According to expert testimony, it was capable of destroying biological material far more thoroughly than an ordinary fire. When forensic teams examined the incinerator, they recovered dozens of small bone fragments and tooth pieces. Specialists later testified that the fragments were human and that their size and condition were consistent with exposure to extreme heat. While no complete remains were ever recovered, the Crown argued that the fragments told a clear story. Tim Bosma had been killed, and efforts had been made to destroy his body. That conclusion was reinforced by what investigators found inside Tim's truck. After the vehicle was recovered, forensic testing revealed traces of Tim's blood inside the cabin. The quantity and placement of the blood were central to the Crown's case. Prosecutors argued that the blood evidence showed Tim had been shot while seated inside his own truck, not outside it, and not during a chaotic struggle. The interior of the vehicle, they said, had become the crime scene. Another critical piece of evidence surfaced during the search of Millard's vehicle. Inside, police found keys belonging to Tim's truck. The Crown highlighted this discovery as especially damaging. If Millard had no role in the crime, prosecutors are to Gued. There would be no explanation for why the victim's keys were in his possession. Together, the incinerator fragments, the blood evidence, and the keys formed what the Crown called a physical trail, one that connected Tim Bosma directly to Millard's property and possessions, even in the absence of a body. But the case did not end with forensics. It moved into the courtroom, where two sharply different versions of events were presented. Millard's defense acknowledged that Tim Bosma had died, but rejected the idea of a planned killing. His lawyer argued that the shooting was accidental. According to the defense, a struggle broke out inside the truck. A gun was present, and it discharged unintentionally. In this version of events, panic followed, and the choices made afterward, including the use of the incinerator, were the actions of someone trying to cover up a terrible accident, rather than carry out a premeditated crime. The Crown dismantled that theory piece by piece. Prosecutors pointed to the blood evidence inside the truck, arguing it was inconsistent with a sudden struggle. They highlighted the controlled environment of the vehicle and the absence of signs supporting a chaotic confrontation. They emphasized the planning involved in bringing a firearm, arranging the late-night meeting, and having access to an incinerator ready to be used. The Crown's position was clear. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate act. The case against Mark Smich followed a different path. Smich did not take the stand, and his defense denied involvement in the shooting itself. His lawyers argued that he did not pull the trigger and did not intend for anyone to die. They framed him as a secondary figure, present but not responsible for the fatal act. Prosecutors countered by outlining Smich's actions before and after Tim Bosma's death. They presented evidence showing coordination between Smich and Millard, including movements, communications, and behavior that suggested awareness and participation. The Crown argued that even if Smich did not fire the shot, he was an active participant in a planned crime that led directly to murder. At the heart of the trial was the question of motive. Why would two men arrange a late-night test drive with a stranger and then kill him? The Crown's answer was robbery. Prosecutors argued that Tim Bosma was targeted so his truck could be stolen. They presented evidence of Millard's financial difficulties at the time, including mounting debt and strained resources despite his wealthy background. The theory was not that Millard was poor, but that he was desperate to maintain a lifestyle he could no longer easily afford. Vehicle theft, the Crown argued, was part of a pattern, a way to solve problems quickly and quietly. Defense lawyers rejected that explanation, calling it speculative. But the jury heard evidence showing that the meeting was not spontaneous, that the location and timing were chosen carefully, and that both accused arrived prepared. As the trial unfolded, the Crown also hinted at a broader pattern surrounding Millard, without fully exploring it yet. References were made to other investigations, other victims, and other cases that would come later. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Tim Bosma's death was not an isolated event. That revelation would be fully addressed in later proceedings. For now, the focus remained on the evidence in front of the jury. The fragments recovered from the incinerator, the blood inside the truck, the keys in Millard's vehicle, and the conflicting stories offered by the defense. When taken together, the Crown argued, those elements formed a single narrative. A meeting was arranged, a truck was taken, a man was shot and killed, and extraordinary steps were taken to erase him. The defense asked the jury to believe it was all a tragic accident. The Crown asked them to see it for what it was, a planned crime that ended a life and shattered a family forever. On June 17, 2016, the courtroom in Hamilton, Ontario was silent in a way that felt heavy rather than calm. For weeks, jurors had listened to testimony about incinerators, phone records, blood evidence, and late-night movements. Now, after 5 full days of deliberation, they were ready to deliver their decision. The case had never been simple. There was no complete body. Much of what the jury had been asked to consider was circumstantial, layered carefully through forensic detail and timelines. But when the foreperson stood and spoke, there was no hesitation. Dellen Millard was found guilty of first-degree murder. Mark Smich was found guilty of first-degree murder. In Canadian law, that verdict carried a specific meaning. First-degree murder is reserved for killings that are planned and deliberate, or that occur during the commission of another serious offense. The jury had accepted the Crown's position in full. This was not an accident. It was not a moment of panic. It was a crime carried out with intent. As the verdict was read, reactions inside the courtroom were restrained, almost subdued. Outside, the impact was immediate. Members of the Bosma family stood together, some holding each other, absorbing a decision that confirmed what they had already been living with for 3 years. Charlene Bosma addressed reporters shortly afterward. Her words were calm, deliberate, and devastating. She spoke about Tim, about the life they had planned, and about the daughter who would now grow up without her father. She thanked investigators and the jury, but she did not describe the verdict as closure. She described it as accountability. Sentencing followed quickly. Under Canadian law, a conviction for first-degree murder carries an automatic life sentence, with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. There was no discretion. The judge imposed the mandatory sentence on both me and They would spend the rest of their lives under federal custody, with their first chance at parole review coming no earlier than 2041. As the courtroom emptied, the legal chapter of Tim Bosma's case appeared to be over. But the story did not stop there. In the months and years that followed, the scope of Millard's criminal history widened dramatically. In December 2017, Millard and Smich were convicted in a separate case involving the murder of Laura Babcock, a young woman who had disappeared in 2012. Evidence presented at that trial showed a similar pattern of planning and concealment. Once again, the same incinerator was central to the Crown's case. Once again, prosecutors argued that extraordinary measures were taken to erase a human life. Both men were found guilty. The court imposed another life sentence, and at the time, the judge ordered that the parole ineligibility periods be stacked consecutively. For Millard, that meant he would not be eligible for parole for 50 years. For Smich, the total reached 50 as well. Then came another conviction. In September 2018, Millard was found guilty of murdering his father, Wayne Millard. Prosecutors argued that the killing was financially motivated, tied to inheritance and control of family assets. With that verdict, Millard became a rare case in Canadian history, convicted of 3 separate murders, each involving a different victim and circumstance. Over time, legal challenges followed. In 2022, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that stacking parole ineligibility periods beyond 25 years violated the Charter. As a result, Millard and Smich's sentences were adjusted to reflect a single 25-year period before parole eligibility, though life imprisonment remained in place. For the Bosma family, those legal shifts changed little in practical terms. Tim Bosma was still gone. The verdict in 2016 had not restored what was taken, but it had drawn a firm line between truth and denial. The jury had rejected the idea of a tragic accident. They had rejected attempts to soften intent or shift responsibility. Instead, they concluded that Tim Bosma was deliberately targeted, shot, and killed during a planned crime, and that steps were taken afterward to ensure he could not be found. That decision mattered, not just legally, but publicly. It affirmed that even without a complete body, even without eyewitnesses to every moment, a case built carefully on evidence could still reach the truth. It affirmed that the story told by the Crown of planning, control, and deliberate action was stronger than any alternative explanation offered in defense. Outside the courthouse that day, cameras captured Charlene Bosma standing steady as she spoke. She did not call for vengeance. She did not raise her voice. She spoke about her husband as a person, not as a headline, and about the responsibility of remembering who he was beyond the crime that ended his life. The verdict marked the peak of the case, the moment when uncertainty finally collapsed into fact. And yet, even then, it left behind a question that no sentence could answer: how a simple test drive, arranged on an ordinary evening, led to one of the most disturbing crime stories in Canadian history. In the days after the verdict, the Bosma family stepped back into a life permanently altered. Outside the courthouse in Hamilton, cameras captured a quiet moment as supporters gathered, many holding candles, some embracing strangers they had never met before this case. Across Ancaster and the wider Hamilton area, vigils were held in Tim Bosma's name, not as protests, but as moments of shared grief. For many in the community, the case had shattered a sense of everyday safety. Charlene Bosma spoke publicly with restraint and clarity. She thanked investigators, prosecutors, and the jury, but made it clear that no verdict could restore what had been taken. Tim, she said, was more than a case file or a headline. He was a husband, a father, and a man whose absence would be felt in quiet moments for the rest of their lives. Community leaders echoed that sentiment, describing Tim as someone ordinary in the best possible way. A reminder that random violence leaves no neat edges behind. Legally, however, the story continued to widen. For the Bosma family, those legal recalculations did little to change reality. Tim Bosma did not come back. What remained was memory, community, and a case that reshaped how Canadians thought about trust, routine, and the dangers hidden inside ordinary moments. Tim Bosma's story didn't begin with danger. It began with something most people have done without a second thought: meeting a stranger to sell a vehicle. A routine exchange, a short drive, a plan to be home before the night was over. What followed exposed how thin the line can be between ordinary life and irreversible loss. There were no dramatic warnings that night, no alarms, just small details that only seem important in hindsight: a late meeting, unfamiliar buyers, a moment of trust that couldn't be taken back. And for Tim Bosma, that moment ended everything. For his family, justice came in the form of verdicts and sentences, but justice is not the same as healing. Charlene Bosma did not get her husband back. A daughter grew up without her father. A future quietly disappeared, replaced by anniversaries that will always carry weight. This case forced a country to confront uncomfortable questions. How much trust do we place in strangers we meet online? What precautions are enough, and which ones only feel obvious after it's too late? And when the courts have spoken, when the evidence has been weighed and the sentences handed down, what does justice really mean for the people left behind? There are no easy answers, only reflections. So I'll leave you with this, not as a judgment, but as a question worth sitting with. If you had been in Charlene's shoes that night, if someone you loved stepped out for a routine meeting and didn't come back, what would you have done differently, if anything at all?